David Carter checked his watch as he pulled out of his mother's driveway. The Sunday afternoon visit had run longer than planned, but he didn't mind. At 68, his mom was still sharp as ever, filling him in on neighborhood gossip and making sure he took home enough leftovers to last the week. He smiled thinking about her insistence that he wasn't eating enough, even though he'd put on a few pounds since turning 40. The drive through Oakwood Heights always felt like entering a different world. Manicured lawns stretched endlessly, each house seemingly trying to outdo the next with elaborate fountains and perfectly trimmed hedges. David had grown up just 10 miles away, but it might as well have been a different planet. His mother still lived in the same small house where he'd learned to ride a bike and done homework at the kitchen table. She refused to move, even though he could easily afford to relocate her somewhere nicer. He was wearing his weekend clothes, faded jeans, a comfortable hoodie from his law school, and worn sneakers. After 6 days a week in expensive suits, Sundays were his day to dress like a regular person. The luxury sedan was a recent purchase, something his financial advisor had suggested as a smart investment. David still felt a bit awkward driving it, remembering his first car, a beat-up Honda that barely made it through college. Traffic was light on the tree-lined streets. He kept to the speed limit, hands at 10 and 2, following every rule his father had drilled into him during those first driving lessons 30 years ago. Always give them one less reason, his dad used to say, though back then David hadn't fully understood what he meant. The red and blue lights appeared suddenly in his rearview mirror. David's stomach dropped the way it always did, even though he knew he hadn't done anything wrong. He'd been going exactly 25 miles per hour, hadn't run any stop signs, hadn't even changed lanes. Still, his heart started beating faster as he pulled over to the curb. 2 officers stepped out of the patrol car. The first was tall and stocky with a buzz cut and sunglasses despite the overcast afternoon. His partner was shorter but built like he spent serious time at the gym. Both approached with their hands resting on their duty belts, a posture David recognized from too many similar encounters over the years. David rolled down his window and placed both hands clearly on the steering wheel. "Good afternoon, officers," he said politely. "License and registration," the taller officer said without returning the greeting. His name tag read Patterson. "Of course. My license is in my wallet in my back pocket, and the registration is in the glove compartment. I'm going to reach for them slowly, okay?" Patterson's partner, whose badge said Wilson, stepped closer to the passenger side window. "Just get them out." David carefully retrieved his license, then reached across to open the glove compartment. The registration was right where it should be, in a neat folder along with his insurance card. He handed everything through the window. Patterson studied the documents for what felt like forever. "This your car?" "Yes, sir, it is." "What are you doing in this neighborhood?" The question caught David off guard. "I was visiting my mother. She lives about 6 blocks from here." "Uh-huh." Patterson exchanged a look with Wilson. "Step out of the vehicle." "May I ask why you pulled me over?" "I don't believe I was speeding or—" "Step out of the vehicle," Wilson repeated, his hand moving closer to his weapon. David's mouth went dry. He'd been through this before, but it never got easier. Slowly he opened the door and stepped onto the sidewalk. A jogger passed by, giving them a curious glance before continuing down the street. "Turn around and put your hands on the car," Patterson ordered. "Officers, I haven't done anything wrong. Could you please tell me why I'm being detained?" "We'll ask the questions here," Wilson said, moving around to stand behind David. "We received reports of suspicious activity in the area. Someone matching your description." David knew better than to argue, even though the explanation made no sense. He placed his palms flat against the roof of his car and felt Wilson's hands patting him down roughly. The officer checked every pocket, every fold of clothing, making the process as invasive as possible. "Car smells like marijuana," Patterson announced, though David had never used drugs in his life. "That's impossible," David said. "I don't smoke anything." "You calling us liars?" Wilson's voice had an edge now. "No, sir. I'm just saying there's no way my car could smell like marijuana because I've never had any in there." Patterson was already walking around the vehicle, peering through the windows. "We're going to need to search this car. Do you have a warrant?" David asked quietly. Both officers stopped what they were doing. The question seemed to flip a switch in their demeanor. "You some kind of lawyer?" Patterson sneered. David hesitated. In situations like this, mentioning his profession sometimes helped, but it could just as easily make things worse. I'm just asking about my rights. Your rights? Wilson laughed, but there was no humor in it. Your right is to do what we tell you to do. More people were starting to notice the scene. A woman walking her dog had stopped across the street, phone in hand. 2 teenagers on bikes had paused at the corner. David felt exposed, humiliated, but also oddly grateful for the witnesses. Look, David said, trying to keep his voice calm and reasonable. I understand you're doing your job. I'm happy to cooperate. But I'd like to know what law I've broken. Patterson stepped closer, invading David's personal space. You got an attitude problem, you know that? I'm just trying to understand. Hands behind your back, Wilson ordered, pulling out his handcuffs. Wait, what? For what? Obstruction of justice. Resisting arrest. I'm not resisting anything. I've been completely cooperative. But Wilson was already grabbing David's wrist, twisting it behind his back with more force than necessary. David instinctively pulled away from the pain, and that was all the excuse they needed. He's resisting, Patterson shouted loud enough for everyone to hear. Both officers grabbed David, slamming him against the car. His face pressed into the cold metal of the roof while they wrenched his arms behind his back. The handcuffs bit into his wrists as they tightened them too tight. I'm not resisting, David said as clearly as he could manage with his cheek against the car. I'm not resisting. Patterson leaned close to his ear. You should have just kept your mouth shut. The woman with the dog was definitely recording now. So were the teenagers. David hoped their footage would be clearer than the fear and adrenaline clouding his own thoughts. They searched his car anyway, despite his lack of consent and their lack of a warrant. David watched helplessly from the back of the patrol car as they went through everything. His briefcase, his gym bag, even the leftovers from his mother's kitchen. Wilson emerged from the passenger side holding a small plastic bag between his fingers. Well, what do we have here? David's blood turned to ice. That's not mine. Sure it isn't, Patterson said, photographing the bag with his phone. They never are. The bag was so small it could have fit in a matchbox. David had no idea what was in it, but he knew without a doubt that it hadn't been in his car when he'd left his mother's house. The officer's satisfied expressions told him everything he needed to know about where it had come from. As they drove toward the station, David stared out the window at the tree-lined streets of Oakwood Heights. An hour ago, he'd been a successful professional heading home from a family visit. Now he was facing charges that could destroy everything he'd worked for. The irony wasn't lost on him that his mother's neighborhood, the place he'd always felt least welcome, was where his carefully built life might finally come crashing down. The courthouse smelled like disinfectant and broken dreams. David had been in countless courtrooms before, but never from this side of the process. The orange jumpsuit felt like sandpaper against his skin, and the shackles around his ankles made every step a reminder of how quickly life could change. 3 days had passed since his arrest. 3 days in a county jail cell, eating terrible food and sleeping on a thin mattress that felt like cardboard. His face still showed the bruises from where the officers had pressed him against the car. The worst part wasn't the physical discomfort. It was the knowledge that somewhere his mother was probably worried sick, wondering why he hadn't called or visited. The arraignment courtroom was packed with other defendants and their families. Everyone looked tired, stressed, and vaguely defeated. David recognized the expression from his mirror that morning, the look of people caught in a system that seemed designed to grind them down. Judge Harrison Brennan entered the courtroom like he owned the world. He was a man in his early 60s with silver hair and the kind of confident bearing that came from decades of absolute authority. His robe seemed to make him stand taller, and when he took his seat at the bench, everyone in the room automatically straightened up. David had heard of Judge Brennan before. The man had a reputation for being tough on crime, which usually meant tough on defendants. He ran his courtroom like a military operation and had little patience for what he called excuses and sob stories. Local attorneys either loved him or feared him, depending on which side of the law they represented. The court-appointed attorney assigned to David looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. Robert Hayes was probably in his 30s, but he had the exhausted appearance of someone much older. His briefcase was stuffed with files, and he kept checking his watch as if he was already late for his next appointment. So, David, I've had a chance to review your case. Hayes said during their brief meeting before the hearing. The charges are serious. Obstruction of justice, resisting arrest, and possession of a controlled substance. The prosecutors are offering a plea deal. What kind of plea deal? 6 months in county jail, 2 years probation, community service, and a fine. It's actually not bad considering what you're facing. David stared at him. Not bad? I didn't do anything wrong. Hayes sighed. Look, I understand you feel that way, but we've got 2 police officers who say otherwise. They found drugs in your car. The system isn't perfect, but fighting it rarely works out well for defendants. Those drugs weren't mine. They planted them. Can you prove that? The question hung in the air. David knew he couldn't prove it, at least not easily. It would be his word against 2 sworn officers, and he'd already learned how that usually played out. I want to fight the charges, David said firmly. Hayes looked uncomfortable. I have to advise you that's probably not the best strategy. Judge Brennan doesn't like defendants who waste the court's time. If we go to trial and lose, he'll throw the book at you. I didn't do anything wrong, David repeated. I'm not pleading guilty to something I didn't do. Your choice, Hayes said. But his tone suggested he thought it was a bad one. When David's case was called, he stood up carefully. The shackles made it difficult to maintain dignity, but he tried anyway. Judge Brennan looked down at him with the kind of expression someone might use when examining something unpleasant on their shoe. David Carter, the judge read from his papers, charged with obstruction of justice, resisting arrest, and possession of a controlled substance. He looked up. How do you plead? David's throat felt dry. The courtroom was quiet except for the hum of the air conditioning and the shuffling of papers. Not guilty, Your Honor. Judge Brennan's eyebrows rose slightly. Mr. Hayes, I trust you've explained the prosecution's generous offer to your client? Yes, Your Honor. Mr. Carter wishes to reject the plea and proceed to trial. The judge's expression hardened. Mr. Carter, do you understand the seriousness of these charges? Drug possession is a felony. Combined with the other charges, you could be looking at significant prison time. I understand, Your Honor, but I'm innocent. They all say that. Judge Brennan's voice carried a tone of practiced skepticism. Mr. Hayes, I hope you've impressed upon your client the risks of going to trial. David felt heat rise in his chest. The judge was talking about him like he wasn't even there, dismissing his claim of innocence without a second thought. Your Honor, may I speak? Judge Brennan looked surprised by the interruption. You have counsel to speak for you, Mr. Carter. Yes, sir, but I'd like to represent myself. The courtroom stirred slightly. Hayes looked mortified. Judge Brennan leaned back in his chair with what might have been amusement. You want to represent yourself? Do you have any legal training, Mr. Carter? David hesitated. This was the moment where he could reveal his profession, where he could change the entire dynamic of the courtroom. But something held him back. Maybe it was pride, or maybe it was curiosity about how the system would treat him if they thought he was just another defendant. I've studied the law, Your Honor. Oh, you've studied the law. Judge Brennan's tone was mocking now. Where exactly? YouTube University? The jailhouse library? Laughter rippled through the courtroom. David felt his face burn with humiliation, but he kept his voice steady. I believe I have the right to represent myself if I choose. You have the right to make terrible decisions, yes. But let me be clear, Mr. Carter. If you choose to represent yourself, I won't hold your hand. I won't explain procedure to you. You'll be held to the same standards as any attorney who appears in my courtroom. Do you understand? I understand, Your Honor. Judge Brennan shook his head slowly. Mr. Hayes, your client is making a mistake. Are you sure you can't talk sense into him? Hayes looked between David and the judge helplessly. I've advised him of the risks, Your Honor. Very well, Mr. Carter. Against my better judgment and your attorney's advice, I'll grant your request to represent yourself. Mr. Hayes, you'll remain as standby counsel. The judge shuffled through his papers. Now let's discuss bail. David's heart jumped. Maybe he could get out of this place, go home, shower, eat real food, and prepare his defense properly. The prosecution is requesting that bail be denied, the prosecutor announced. David hadn't really noticed her before. A sharp-looking woman in her 40s with perfectly styled hair and an expensive suit. On what grounds? David asked. Judge Brennan's eyes narrowed. The prosecution will state their grounds. Mr. Carter, you don't get to ask questions until it's your turn. Your Honor, the prosecutor continued. Mr. Carter showed a pattern of non-compliance during his arrest. He argued with officers, questioned their authority, and showed signs of being a flight risk. Given the serious nature of these charges, the state believes he poses a danger to the community. David couldn't believe what he was hearing. Your Honor, I've never been arrested before. I have deep community ties, a steady job, and no history of violence. I'm not a flight risk. What's your employment, Mr. Carter? Judge Brennan asked. Another moment where David could change everything. I work in the legal field, Your Honor. Legal field? Are you a paralegal? Court reporter. David felt the weight of the moment. I'm an attorney. The courtroom went quiet. Judge Brennan's expression shifted slightly, but not in the way David had expected. Instead of respect or recognition, there was something that looked almost like irritation. An attorney, the judge repeated slowly. And you didn't think to mention this earlier? It didn't seem relevant to the charges, Your Honor. Judge Brennan leaned forward. It's relevant to everything, Mr. Carter. If you're really an attorney, then you know better than most how serious these charges are. You also know that playing games with this court is not advisable. The prosecutor looked uncomfortable with this new information, but she pressed on. Even more reason to deny bail, Your Honor. An attorney would know exactly how to manipulate the system and evade justice. David felt the walls closing in around him. Revealing his profession hadn't helped. It had somehow made things worse. Judge Brennan was looking at him like he was some kind of con artist trying to pull a fast one. Your Honor, I respectfully request reasonable bail. I have no criminal history, strong ties to the community, and I'm certainly not going to flee. Judge Brennan was quiet for a long moment, studying David with those cold eyes. Mr. Carter, I find it curious that an attorney would end up in this situation. It suggests either extremely poor judgment or something more troubling. The implication hit David like a punch to the stomach. The judge was suggesting that his arrest was somehow evidence of guilt, that an attorney should have been smart enough to avoid getting caught. Bail is denied, Judge Brennan announced. Trial is set for 3 weeks from today. Mr. Carter, I suggest you use that time to reconsider the prosecution's offer. It may not be available much longer. As the bailiff approached to escort him back to his cell, David felt the full weight of what had just happened. He'd revealed his profession, thinking it would help his situation, but instead it had seemed to make Judge Brennan even more suspicious of him. The system he'd devoted his career to serving was treating him like a criminal, and there seemed to be nothing he could do about it. Walking back through the courthouse corridors in shackles, David realized that his real trial had already begun. It wasn't going to be about the evidence or the law. It was going to be about whether anyone would believe that a successful attorney could find himself on the wrong side of justice through no fault of his own. The trial began on a Tuesday morning when the rain was coming down so hard it sounded like pebbles hitting the courthouse windows. David had spent 3 weeks in county jail preparing for this moment, studying law books and writing notes on whatever paper he could get his hands on. His orange jumpsuit had been replaced with a cheap suit that the public defender's office had provided, but it was wrinkled and didn't fit properly. Judge Brennan entered the courtroom with his usual commanding presence. David noticed how the atmosphere changed when the judge appeared. Everyone straightened up, conversation stopped, and even the court reporter seemed to type more quietly. The man had that effect on people, like he carried the weight of absolute authority wherever he went. The prosecutor, Linda Morrison, looked confident as she arranged her files at the prosecution table. She was the kind of lawyer who never seemed to have a hair out of place, and her expensive suit probably cost more than most people made in a month. She'd built her career on putting people away, and she had the conviction rate to prove it. David sat alone at the defense table. His standby attorney, Hayes, was technically available for consultation, but David had chosen to handle his own defense. Looking back, he wondered if that had been pride or stupidity. Maybe both. All rise, the bailiff announced. The Honorable Judge Harrison Brennan presiding. Judge Brennan took his seat and surveyed the courtroom. His eyes lingered on David for a moment, and David couldn't shake the feeling that the judge had already made up his mind about the case. Good morning, Judge Brennan said. We're here for the trial of the state versus David Carter. Counselor Morrison, are you ready to proceed? Yes, Your Honor. Morrison stood with practiced grace. The state is ready. Mr. Carter? David stood up, feeling the weight of every eye in the courtroom. Ready, Your Honor. Judge Brennan nodded. Very well. Counselor Morrison, your opening statement. Morrison approached the jury with the confidence of someone who'd done this hundreds of times. The 12 jurors looked like a cross-section of the community. Working people, retirees, a few who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Morrison began, "this case is about respect for law and order. It's about what happens when someone thinks they're above the rules that govern the rest of us." She turned slightly, gesturing toward David. The defendant, David Carter, was pulled over by 2 experienced police officers for suspicious behavior in a quiet neighborhood. Instead of cooperating with a routine traffic stop, he became argumentative and hostile. When the officers detected the smell of marijuana coming from his vehicle and attempted to conduct a lawful search, Mr. Carter obstructed their investigation and physically resisted arrest. David watched the jurors' faces carefully. Some were nodding along with Morrison's words. Others looked skeptical, but he couldn't tell if their skepticism was directed at him or the prosecution's story. During their search, Morrison continued, "Officers discovered a bag of cocaine in Mr. Carter's vehicle. The evidence will show that Mr. Carter knew exactly what he was carrying and became desperate when he realized he was about to be caught." Morrison walked closer to the jury box. "Now you'll hear the defendant claim that this was all some kind of mistake, that he was targeted unfairly. But the evidence doesn't lie. 2 trained police officers will testify about what they observed. Physical evidence was recovered from the scene, and you'll see that Mr. Carter's behavior throughout this incident was consistent with someone who knew he was guilty." She paused for effect. "The defendant wants you to believe that he's the victim here. But the real victims are the citizens of our community who depend on our police officers to keep them safe. When someone resists arrest and obstructs justice, they're not just breaking the law. They're undermining the very foundation of public safety." Morrison returned to her table. "At the end of this trial, I'm confident you'll find David Carter guilty on all charges." "Thank you." Judge Brennan looked toward David. "Mr. Carter, your opening statement." David stood and walked toward the jury. His legs felt unsteady, but he tried to project confidence he didn't entirely feel. These 12 people were about to decide his future, and he had one chance to make them see the truth. "Members of the jury, my name is David Carter, and I'm innocent of these charges." He looked each juror in the eye, trying to establish a connection. 3 weeks ago, I was driving home from visiting my mother when I was pulled over for no apparent reason. I cooperated fully with the officers. I answered their questions politely. I provided my license and registration without complaint. David moved slowly, not wanting to appear aggressive or threatening. But despite my cooperation, the situation escalated quickly. I was searched without my consent and without a warrant. I was physically assaulted when I tried to exercise my constitutional rights, and evidence was planted in my vehicle, evidence that I had never seen before in my life. He could see some jurors leaning forward, paying attention. Others looked skeptical. "The prosecution wants you to believe that I'm some kind of criminal who was caught red-handed. But I ask you to consider this. Why would an attorney, someone who understands the law and the consequences of breaking it, carry drugs in his car during a simple visit to see his mother?" "It doesn't make sense," David paused, letting that sink in. "What does make sense is that 2 police officers made assumptions about me based on my appearance and decided to justify those assumptions after the fact. The evidence will show that their story is full of contradictions and impossibilities." He walked back toward his table. "I'm not asking you to take my word for it. I'm asking you to examine the evidence carefully, to listen to the testimony critically, and to remember that in this country, people are innocent until proven guilty beyond a reasonable doubt." "Thank you." Judge Brennan nodded. "Counselor Morrison, call your first witness." The state calls Officer Bradley Patterson. Officer Patterson entered the courtroom in his dress uniform, looking every inch the professional law enforcement officer. He was tall, clean-cut, and carried himself with military bearing. David remembered him clearly from the traffic stop, the taller of the 2 officers, the one who'd seemed to be in charge. Morrison walked Patterson through his credentials: 10 years on the force, numerous commendations, specialized training in drug recognition. She was building him up as a credible, experienced professional whose word could be trusted. "Officer Patterson, please tell the jury about the events of Sunday, October 15th, Patterson sat up straight and spoke clearly. "My partner, Officer Wilson, and I were patrolling the Oakwood Heights area when we observed a vehicle being driven in a suspicious manner." "What made the driving suspicious?" The defendant was driving slowly, looking around at houses, appearing to case the neighborhood. Given the recent break-ins in that area, we decided to conduct a traffic stop. David made notes furiously. That wasn't what had happened at all. He'd been driving normally, not slowly, and certainly not casing anything. What happened when you approached the vehicle? The defendant seemed nervous and agitated. When I asked for his license and registration, he began asking questions about why he'd been stopped. His behavior raised red flags immediately. Morrison nodded sympathetically. What happened next? I asked him to step out of the vehicle for safety reasons. He became argumentative and confrontational. I detected a strong odor of marijuana coming from inside the car. David wanted to object. There had been no marijuana smell because he'd never had marijuana in his car, but Judge Brennan was watching him carefully, and David didn't want to appear to be constantly interrupting. Did you request to search the vehicle? Yes, based on the odor of marijuana, which gave us probable cause. The defendant refused and became increasingly hostile. What did you do then? We attempted to detain him for further investigation, but he physically resisted. He pulled away when Officer Wilson tried to place him in handcuffs and made threatening gestures toward us. David's jaw clenched. Every word was a lie, but Patterson was delivering it with complete conviction. Morrison continued the questioning for another 20 minutes, letting Patterson paint a picture of David as an uncooperative suspect who'd escalated a routine traffic stop into a confrontation. When she was finished, Judge Brennan looked toward David. Mr. Carter, your cross-examination? David stood up, his heart pounding. This was it. His chance to expose the lies and contradictions in Patterson's story. Officer Patterson, you testified that I was driving suspiciously. Can you be more specific about what I was doing wrong? Objection, Morrison said immediately. Asked and answered. Judge Brennan sustained the objection before David could respond. Sustained. Move on, Mr. Carter. David tried a different approach. Officer Patterson, what was the posted speed limit on the street where you stopped me? 25 miles per hour. And how fast was I driving? Patterson hesitated slightly. You were driving slowly below the speed limit, so I was obeying the traffic laws? Objection, Morrison interjected. Argumentative. Sustained, Judge Brennan ruled. Mr. Carter, ask questions, don't make arguments. David felt frustrated but pressed on. Officer Patterson, you said you smelled marijuana in my car. How long have you been trained in drug recognition? I completed the training program 5 years ago. And in your expert opinion, how much marijuana would need to be in a vehicle for you to smell it from outside? Patterson looked uncomfortable. That would depend on various factors. Ventilation, time since use, quantity of the substance. But you're certain you smelled marijuana? Yes. David paused, consulting his notes. Officer Patterson, your report states that you found a small bag of what appeared to be cocaine in my vehicle, correct? That's correct. Not marijuana, cocaine? Yes. So you smelled marijuana but found cocaine? Morrison stood up. Objection, Your Honor. The defendant is mischaracterizing the testimony. Judge Brennan looked annoyed. Mr. Carter, if you have a point to make it clearly. David felt the walls closing in again. Every question he asked seemed to be met with an objection that the judge sustained. Meanwhile, Morrison had been allowed to present Patterson's story without any significant challenges. He tried several more questions, attempting to expose the inconsistencies in Patterson's account. But Judge Brennan sustained objection after objection. The pattern was becoming clear to everyone in the courtroom. The judge was giving the prosecution every benefit of the doubt, while scrutinizing David's every move. When David finally sat down, he felt defeated. Patterson's lies were now part of the official record, and David hadn't been able to effectively challenge them. Morrison called Officer Wilson next, and his testimony echoed Patterson's in every detail. The two officers had clearly gotten their story straight, presenting a unified front that painted David as an uncooper, aided criminal who'd brought his troubles on himself. During his cross-examination of Wilson, David tried to highlight the suspicious similarity between the two officers' accounts. But again, he was met with sustained objections and judicial impatience. By the end of the first day, David realized he was fighting an uphill battle not just against the prosecution, but against the judge himself. Judge Brennan's bias was becoming more obvious with each ruling, each sustained objection, each dismissive comment, As the bailiff prepared to escort David back to his cell, he caught sight of his mother in the gallery. She'd managed to attend the trial despite her age and limited mobility. The pain in her eyes was almost too much for David to bear. She'd raised him to believe in justice and fairness, in the idea that truth would prevail. Now, sitting in a courtroom where the judge seemed determined to see him convicted regardless of the evidence, David wondered if everything he'd believed about the legal system had been a lie. The third day of trial began like the others, with Judge Brennan taking his seat with imperial authority, and David feeling like he was fighting a losing battle. The prosecution had presented their case methodically. The officer's testimony, the physical evidence, expert witnesses who validated the drug testing. Everything was falling into place for a conviction. David had spent the night in his cell going over his defense strategy one more time. He had witness statements from people who'd recorded parts of his arrest, character references from colleagues, and his own testimony about what had really happened. But none of it seemed to matter in Judge Brennan's courtroom, where every ruling favored the prosecution. "Mr. Carter," Judge Brennan said, "are you ready to present your defense?" David stood up, straightening his ill-fitting suit jacket. "Yes, Your Honor, but before I begin, I'd like to call my first witness." "Proceed." "I call Rebecca Chen to the stand." A young woman in her 20s entered the courtroom. She was the jogger who'd been passing by during David's arrest, and she'd agreed to testify about what she'd witnessed. David hoped her testimony might help the jury see through the officer's lies. Chen was sworn in and took her seat. She looked nervous but determined. "Ms. Chen, where were you on the afternoon of October 15th? "I was jogging through Oakwood Heights like I do every Sunday." "Did you witness an interaction between me and two police officers?" "Yes, I saw them pull you over and arrest you." David felt a spark of hope. Finally, an independent witness. "Can you describe what you observed?" "Well, I saw you get out of your car when they told you to. You seemed calm, cooperative. You had your hands visible the whole time. Did you see me resist arrest or become violent?" Chen shook her head. "No, not at all. You kept saying you weren't resisting even when they were putting handcuffs on you." Morrison jumped up. "Objection, Your Honor. The witness lacks foundation to interpret the defendant's intent or state of mind." Judge Brennan nodded. "Sustained. The jury will disregard the witness's interpretation of the defendant's mental state." David tried again. "Ms. Chen, did you record any of the incident on your phone?" "I started to, yes, but one of the officers saw me and told me to move along." "Did you feel like you were being prevented from recording a public arrest?" "Objection," Morrison called out. "Calls for speculation about the witness's feelings." "Sustained," Judge Brennan ruled immediately. David was getting frustrated with the pattern, but he pressed on. After a few more questions, all met with objections that the judge sustained, Chen was dismissed. Her testimony had been effectively neutered by the court's rulings. David called two more witnesses, the teenagers who'd been riding bikes when they saw the arrest. Their testimony was similarly hampered by sustained objections and judicial impatience. Judge Brennan kept looking at his watch and making comments about wasting the court's time with irrelevant testimony. By mid-morning, David was preparing to take the stand himself. It was a risky move. Defendants weren't required to testify, and doing so opened them up to cross-examination. But David felt he had no choice. The jury needed to hear his side of the story directly. "Your Honor, I call myself as the next witness." Judge Brennan raised an eyebrow. "Mr. Carter, I trust you understand the implications of testifying on your own behalf?" "I do, Your Honor." David was sworn in and took the witness stand. Looking out at the courtroom, he could see his mother in the gallery, her hands folded tightly in her lap. The jurors were watching him with expressions ranging from curiosity to skepticism. David began to tell his story: the visit to his mother, the routine drive home, the sudden appearance of police lights. He described his cooperation with the officers, his polite responses to their questions, and his confusion when the situation escalated. "Mr. Carter," he asked himself, "did you have any drugs in your vehicle that day?" "No, I did not. I have never used illegal drugs, and I certainly wouldn't carry them in my car." "Can you explain how the officers found a bag of what they claim was cocaine?" "Because they planted it there. I watched Officer Wilson go to his patrol car and come back with something in his hand before they searched my vehicle." Morrison objected to this as speculation, but Judge Brennan surprisingly let it stand. David continued his testimony. describing every detail he could remember about the arrest. When he finished his direct examination, Morrison stood up for cross-examination with a predatory smile. "Mr. Carter, you testified that you're an attorney, correct?" "Yes." "What kind of attorney?" David hesitated. This was dangerous territory, but he'd already revealed his profession during arraignment. "I practice federal law." "Federal law? That's quite prestigious. What specifically do you do in federal law?" Another pause. "I work for the Department of Justice." Morrison's eyebrows shot up. "The Department of Justice? In what capacity?" David's throat felt dry. He'd been hoping to avoid getting into specifics, but Morrison wasn't going to let him dance around it. "I'm a prosecutor." The courtroom stirred. Judge Brennan leaned forward in his chair, suddenly very interested. "A prosecutor," Morrison repeated. "So you're law enforcement yourself, in a sense." "I prosecute federal crimes, yes. And yet you expect this jury to believe that you were unfairly targeted by police officers? That seems quite a coincidence, doesn't it?" Before David could answer, the courtroom doors opened. Every head turned to see who was entering during the middle of testimony. 3 people in dark suits walked purposefully down the aisle, 2 men and a woman, all carrying themselves with the unmistakable bearing of federal agents. Judge Brennan's gavel came down hard. "What is the meaning of this interruption?" The woman in the lead held up her credentials. "Your Honor, I'm Special Agent Jennifer Walsh, FBI. I need to speak with the court immediately." Morrison looked confused. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular." Judge Brennan's face was red with anger. "Agent Walsh, this court is in session. Whatever you need can wait until we're in recess." "I'm afraid it cannot wait, Your Honor." Agent Walsh approached the bench. "This trial needs to be suspended immediately." The judge's voice was dangerously low. "On whose authority?" Agent Walsh handed him a document. "United States Attorney for the Eastern District." David felt his heart stop. The Eastern District. That was his district. His office. Judge Brennan read the document, his face going through several shades of red and white. When he looked up, his eyes found David on the witness stand, and for the first time since the trial began, there was uncertainty in his expression. Agent Walsh continued speaking, her voice carrying clearly through the silent courtroom. "Your Honor, we've been conducting an investigation into civil rights violations by Officers Patterson and Wilson. Mr. Carter's arrest was part of a pattern of misconduct that includes evidence tampering, perjury, and violation of constitutional rights." The courtroom erupted. Morrison shot to her feet. "Your Honor, I object to this entire proceeding." Judge Brennan's gavel came down repeatedly, but the noise continued. David remained on the witness stand, watching the chaos unfold around him. Agent Walsh approached the witness stand and spoke quietly to David. "Sir, we need you to step down from the stand." David looked toward Judge Brennan, who nodded slowly. As David returned to the defense table, Agent Walsh continued her announcement. "Your Honor, the defendant in this case is United States Attorney David Carter. He was conducting a covert investigation into racial profiling and police misconduct when he was arrested. Everything that has transpired in this courtroom has been monitored as part of our investigation." The words hit the courtroom like a bomb. Judge Brennan's face went completely white. Morrison sat down heavily in her chair, looking like she'd been punched in the stomach. The jurors stared in shock. David stood up slowly. For 3 weeks, he'd been treated like a common criminal. He'd endured jail, humiliation, and a biased trial. Now, finally, he could speak with his full authority. "Your Honor," David said, his voice carrying the weight of his real position for the first time, "I am indeed the United States Attorney for the Eastern District. For the past 6 months, my office has been investigating complaints about Officers Patterson and Wilson targeting minority drivers in affluent neighborhoods." Judge Brennan's hands were visibly shaking now. Mr. Carter, I had no idea." "No, you didn't," David said firmly. "And that was the point." His trial, Your Honor, has been an education in how our justice system treats people when they don't have power or connections. Every biased ruling, every sustained objection that should have been overruled, every assumption of guilt, it's all been recorded and documented." Morrison tried to speak. "Your Honor, if this is true, then the prosecution moves to dismiss all charges. The charges against me are the least of anyone's concerns right now," David said. "Agent Walsh, do you have enough evidence to proceed with federal charges?" Walsh nodded. "More than enough." We have video evidence of the officers planting drugs, recorded conversations about targeting minority drivers, and documentation of perjured testimony in multiple cases. Judge Brennan tried to regain control of his courtroom. This is highly unusual. I need to declare a recess to sort this out. Your Honor, David said, there's no need for a recess. The investigation is complete. Officers Patterson and Wilson are about to be arrested on federal charges. The question now is what role, if any, this court played in attempting to obstruct justice. The words hung in the air like a threat. Judge Brennan understood immediately that his own conduct was now under scrutiny. Every biased ruling, every moment where he'd favored the prosecution over the defense, had been witnessed by federal investigators. As if on cue, more FBI agents entered the courtroom and approached Officers Patterson and Wilson, who had been sitting in the gallery. The handcuffs clicking into place echoed through the silent courtroom. Officers Bradley Patterson and Rick Wilson. Agent Walsh announced, "You are under arrest for violation of civil rights under color of law, conspiracy to obstruct justice, and perjury. You have the right to remain silent." David watched as the officers who had destroyed his peaceful Sunday afternoon were led away in handcuffs. The irony wasn't lost on him that they were now experiencing what he'd gone through, except their guilt was real and documented. Judge Brennan finally found his voice. "Mr. Carter, Mr. Attorney, I had no way of knowing." David looked up at the man who had spent 3 days treating him like dirt, dismissing his claims of innocence and showing clear bias against him at every turn. "No, Your Honor, you didn't know who I was, but you should have treated me fairly regardless of who I was. That's what justice means, equal treatment under law, whether the defendant is a homeless person or a federal prosecutor." The courtroom was completely silent now except for the sound of rain still hitting the windows. David gathered his papers and prepared to leave the courthouse as a free man for the first time in 3 weeks. But he knew the real work was just beginning. 6 months later, David stood in a different courtroom, this time as the prosecutor rather than the defendant. The federal courthouse was grander than the county building where his own ordeal had played out, with marble columns and high ceilings that seemed designed to inspire respect for the law. Today, justice would finally be served. Officers Bradley Patterson and Rick Wilson sat at the defense table, looking nothing like the confident law enforcement professionals they'd pretended to be during David's arrest. Patterson kept fidgeting with his tie, while Wilson stared at the table, unable to make eye contact with anyone. Their expensive defense attorneys couldn't hide the fact that the evidence against their clients was overwhelming. The investigation that followed David's revelation had uncovered a systematic pattern of misconduct spanning 3 years. Patterson and Wilson had targeted over 40 minority drivers in affluent neighborhoods, planting evidence in at least 12 cases and committing perjury in court testimony dozens of times. The FBI had recovered body camera footage that the officers claimed had malfunctioned, revealing the truth about their tactics. David had personally reviewed every case, working late into the night to ensure that justice was served not just for himself, but for every person who'd been victimized by these officers. Many of the previous defendants had been wrongfully convicted, spending time in jail for crimes they hadn't committed. Those convictions were being overturned, but the damage to those people's lives could never be fully undone. "All rise," the bailiff announced. The Honorable Judge Patricia Romano presiding. Judge Romano was everything Judge Brennan wasn't: fair, thoughtful, and committed to equal justice under law. She'd reviewed the evidence carefully and had shown no patience for the defense's attempts to minimize the officer's actions. "Good morning," Judge Romano said. "We're here for sentencing in the matter of United States versus Bradley Patterson and Rick Wilson. Counselors, are you ready to proceed?" David stood. "The government is ready, Your Honor." The defense attorneys nodded reluctantly. They'd tried everything to get their clients lighter sentences: cooperation agreements, character witnesses, appeals to the officers' years of service. Nothing had worked because the evidence was too clear and the damage too extensive. "Mr. Patterson and Mr. Wilson," Judge Romano said, "please rise." The two former officers stood shakily. Patterson was crying quietly. Wilson looked like he might be sick. "I've reviewed the evidence in this case extensively," Judge Romano continued. "I've read the victim impact statements. I've considered the arguments for both the prosecution and defense. What you two did wasn't just a betrayal of your oaths as police officers. It was an attack on the very foundation of our justice system. She looked directly at the defendants. You targeted people because of their race. You planted evidence to justify arrests you knew were unlawful. You lied under oath repeatedly, sending innocent people to jail. And you did all of this while hiding behind badges that are supposed to represent protection and service. David had seen judges deliver sentences before, but Judge Romano's words carried special weight because she understood the broader implications of the case. Mr. Patterson, I sentence you to 8 years in federal prison, followed by 3 years of supervised release. You will also pay restitution to all identified victims. Patterson's legs gave out, and he had to be helped back into his chair by his attorney. Mr. Wilson, I sentence you to 7 years in federal prison, followed by 3 years of supervised release, with the same restitution requirements. Wilson didn't react visibly, but his attorney put a steadying hand on his shoulder. Judge Romano wasn't finished. Both of you are permanently barred from any employment in law enforcement at any level. Your police certifications are revoked, and I want to be clear about something. If either of you violates the terms of your supervised release in any way, you will serve the maximum sentence allowed under federal law. As the former officers were led away in handcuffs, David felt a complex mix of emotions. Justice had been served, but it had come at a tremendous cost, not just to him, but to all the other victims who'd suffered because of these officers' actions. The aftermath extended far beyond Patterson and Wilson. The entire police department had been placed under federal oversight, with court-appointed monitors ensuring that proper procedures were followed. Every arrest made by the 2 officers over the previous 3 years was being reviewed, and a victim compensation fund had been established. Judge Harrison Brennan had faced his own reckoning. A judicial conduct review had examined his handling of David's case and found multiple violations of judicial ethics. The review board had access to the courtroom recordings and witness testimony about his biased behavior during the trial. David had testified before the review board, describing how Judge Brennan had consistently ruled against him despite clear procedural errors by the prosecution. The pattern of bias had been impossible to deny, sustained objections that should have been overruled, hostile treatment of defense witnesses, and obvious favoritism toward the prosecution. Judge Brennan had tried to defend his actions, claiming he'd had no way of knowing about the investigation and had simply been doing his job. But the evidence showed a pattern of bias that went beyond David's case. The review board found similar patterns in other cases involving minority defendants. In the end, Judge Brennan had been forced to retire early. He'd avoided criminal charges, but his reputation was destroyed. The mandatory judicial bias training that resulted from his case would affect every judge in the district for years to come. The police department had undergone massive changes as well. The chief had been forced to resign, and new leadership had implemented comprehensive reforms. All officers now wore body cameras that couldn't be turned off or malfunctioned during arrests. Community oversight boards had been established, and new training programs focused on constitutional rights and de-escalation. But perhaps the most significant change was cultural. David's story had been covered extensively by local and national media, sparking conversations about systemic bias in the justice system. The fact that a federal prosecutor had experienced this treatment had made it impossible for people to dismiss the experiences of others who lacked his credentials and connections. David had become an inadvertent advocate for criminal justice reform. He spoke at law schools, training academies, and community forums, sharing his story and emphasizing that the system only worked when it treated everyone fairly, regardless of their race, background, or social status. The question, David would tell audiences, isn't what would have happened if I hadn't been a federal prosecutor. The question is how many people have gone through exactly what I experienced, except they didn't have the resources or position to fight back. 3 months after the officer's sentencing, David received a letter that made everything worthwhile. It was from a young man named Kevin, who had been one of Patterson and Wilson's victims 2 years earlier. Mr. Carter, the letter read, I wanted to thank you for what you did. When those officers arrested me, I knew I was innocent, but nobody would listen. I spent 6 months in jail and lost my job. My girlfriend left me. My family thought I was lying about the planted drugs. I almost gave up on everything. The letter continued. When your case came out and those officers got arrested, my conviction got overturned. But more than that, People finally believed me. My family apologized. I got a settlement from the city that let me go back to school. I'm studying criminal justice now. Because I want to help other people like you helped me, David. Kept that letter in his desk drawer and read it whenever he felt discouraged about the slow pace of change in the justice system. The civil lawsuit against the city had been settled for $12 million, with the money going to all identified victims of the officer's misconduct. David had donated his portion to a legal aid fund that provided representation for people who couldn't afford attorneys. His mother, now 70, had become something of a local celebrity. She gave interviews about raising a son who fought for justice even when the system was stacked against him. I always told him to do the right thing, she would say, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard. The house in Oakwood Heights where David's ordeal had begun now had a small historical marker placed by the community, commemorating the arrest that had exposed systemic corruption in local law enforcement. David drove by it sometimes, remembering that Sunday afternoon when his life had changed forever. On quiet evenings, David would sit in his office and think about the broader lessons of his experience. The justice system wasn't broken. It was working exactly as designed, but that design had flaws that hurt innocent people every day. Real change required constant vigilance and the courage to speak truth to power, even when that power wore robes or carried badges. His story had become required reading at the FBI Training Academy, where new agents learned about the importance of investigating misconduct wherever it occurred. Police departments across the country had updated their training materials to include his case as an example of how quickly things could go wrong when officers made assumptions based on race. But David knew that lasting change required more than training and policies. It required a fundamental shift in how society viewed justice and fairness. His experience had been a harsh reminder that the promise of equal treatment under law was still just that for many people, a promise rather than a reality. As he prepared to leave his office on a Friday evening, David looked at the law degree hanging on his wall. He'd earned it through years of hard work and dedication, believing that he was joining a profession committed to justice for all. His arrest had shaken that faith, but ultimately it had strengthened his resolve to make sure the system lived up to its highest ideals. The phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. It was another attorney, calling about a case involving police misconduct in a neighboring county. David smiled as he picked up the phone. The work continued, and every victory made the next fight a little easier. Justice, he'd learned, wasn't something that happened automatically. It was something that had to be fought for, defended, and earned every single day. And that fight was worth everything, not just for himself, but for every person who deserved to be treated fairly under the law, regardless of who they were or what they looked like. The system could be better. It had to be better, and people like David would keep working to make sure it was.